In some ways, after the birth is the most important part of our life because the birth story that we remember, that we tell others, lasts our lifetime, whereas the birth was really quite short in terms of how long we live, and pregnancy was a bit longer. But our birth story after the birth lasts forever. Now, there are three elements of birth stories, although for a short period of time in the United States, there was a fourth element that got intentionally left behind. The three elements in all birth stories are time factor. I went into labor at 3 in the afternoon. My kid was born at 11 p.m. Or we started drive to the hospital at noon. I had the cesarean at 4. Or my labor lasted for hours and hours and hours. Or my labor lasted for days. Or the first 20 hours of my labor were nothing. And then for 3 hours, it was extremely painful. So you understand the time factor. That's element one. Element two is what they did and didn't do to me. We can either like what they do or not like what they do. And it can sound things like, this is what I wanted in my birth plan. They tried to give it to me, or they wouldn't let me have it, or I had a really gentle internal done, or it was really rough, or my partner was an idiot, or my partner helped me unbelievably well. And the third element is what we feel. Oh, I had terrible back labor for hours and hours. I pushed for hours. Or my second stage was so fast. Or the epidural didn't really fully work. Or I was really surprised at what my labor was like. Between the 1950s and the late 1970s, and I gave birth first in 1970 and last in 1982. For my first birth, there was a fourth element, and that is what we did. Both us as birthing women and our husbands or partners who came in with us to birth coach, because that was the unique period of time in global history in which childbirth skills were taught. In the hospitals in the U.S., it was Lamaze, and the Bradley method was available. In New Zealand, it was Grantley Dick Reed. However, there was a problem from the start. The problem was not that the first classes were being taught. The problem was not that millions of us attended these hospital classes. The problem was not that women coped better. The problem was not that fathers actually knew how to coach to some degree. That was not the problems. The problem, or the gap, was that those skills were targeted to low-risk women to achieve certain goals: natural birth, pain-free labor. That was based on Grantley Dick Reed, childbirth without fear, and without medical care. At that point in the United States, most of us were going into the hospitals. Midwives were outlawed. Each state had its own medical practice act. And of course, there were some home births. And there were a few birth centers, but mostly we were going into the hospital. In other countries in the OECD, like New Zealand, where I lived, home births were normal. Midwives were part of the maternity system and always had been. So those four birth element stories, after the birth, what we remember, my generation of people had an empowered one because we all talked about what we did, whether we were high risk or not, because we were all attending the classes. We knew philosophically if we were high risk, they weren't targeted to us, but we weren't looking to achieve those three goals: natural birth, pain-free labor without medical care. We were looking to cope, manage, work through, deal with, handle, stay on top of, and feel in control because we wanted to reduce suffering in childbirth. The medical profession responds to suffering by giving medical pain relief, epidurals today. Before that, it was something else. I know it's hard for people to believe that historically no traditional culture had birth skills, but I've been in 30 of them, and I can tell you they do not. When you go into a village, a remote village in the middle of nowhere, and you say, how'd your mother teach you to breathe? You come up with 8 different ways. But if you ask them how they make their bread, they each are following the same 11 steps. In the 1950s, the mid-70s, we had a childbirth trend or concept that was skills-based. All of that trend was based on a global childbirth concept that we still live with today. You never know what your birth is going to be like. But that's followed with, therefore, there's nothing you can really do to prepare for it. And what Lamaze and Bradley and Grantley Dick Reed were saying is, yes, low-risk women can prepare for it by learning skills in order to achieve those 3 goals of a natural birth, pain-free labor without medical care. That was the gap, as I said. It should have been for all of us, and that's what we want to enliven now, is that skills should be the foundation for all childbirth preparation. Now, in the 1980s, the natural birth movement became global. It became very, very active, and it was very anti-medical. As you know, it wanted midwives in charge of birth, it wanted women to have home births, and it wanted to give women choices. They didn't feel that the skills had achieved those three goals, but they felt if you said no to medical care, no to interventions, that you could achieve those three goals. Natural birth, which meant no interventions, pain-free labor, which meant you weren't afraid, and without medical care. In other words, you didn't need medical care, because we do all know that pregnancy and childbirth are normal, natural, and physiological life events. We know that. That's true. But when the choice-based childbirth concept arose in the 1980s, fathers were told not to coach. And women were told, women have always given birth. We just know how to do it instinctively, and we should be left alone to discover birth. But the reason fathers came into birth from the 50s to 70s is women had been left alone. We didn't want to be left alone. We wanted somebody to help us. And to help us meant we had to have skills. So ICPA is a perfect organization, International Chiropractic Pediatric Association, because you work with pregnant women. And you can very easily give all the pregnant clients a handout of all the different skills-based methods and direct them to the Pathways Family Magazine website, where they will find a skills-based childbirth hub, and they can pick and choose what skills-based method they want to learn. And you can just keep track of that in your notes. We want people to have good birth stories, and good birth stories may be just the time, what they did or didn't do, and you liked what they did, and what happened to you, it wasn't particularly bad. But we know that the most effective birth stories or when people talk about how well they coped or managed or dealt with or handled or worked with or worked through, stayed on top and felt in control. And when they had a good birth coach, somebody in their family, somebody who would grow with them as a skilled parent and a skilled family, we knew that that gave us the very, very best birth story after the birth. Now, there's one more element about after the birth. That is the third global childbirth goal, which is recovery of the mother and the baby, short, medium, and long term. This is a more complicated issue because the complication has to do with how women recover after the birth. I'm a body worker. I worked with a lot of women my age in the 70s, and many of you listening to this are ICPA members. You work with women whose bodies have been damaged by those natural births. We pee when we cough or laugh or run or jump. We have prolapses. We have difficulty having sex. It's either painful or we don't feel anything. So after the birth is a hugely important part of our life. We also know from our experience in Birthing Better that when we prepare our pregnant body to open up for our baby, that we have vaginal births that do not damage our bodies, and that when we have surgical births, we have the skills to work through the activity of birthing our baby. And therefore, in all births, we feel empowered, and that empowerment stays with us the rest of our lives.